Let's talk about in a practical sense what it looks like getting the UV light in a healthy way.
Yeah, so you really have to be outside to get that because ultraviolet light, even though it's very high frequency and high energy, it does not penetrate very well through objects, through clothes. So you have to be somewhat exposed, and because it cannot penetrate very easily, the sun has to be pretty high in the sky for you to get enough ultraviolet radiation. So wintertime is not a good time to get ultraviolet light. That's why a lot of people supplement with vitamin D. But there's actually more to ultraviolet light than just vitamin D. We did say vitamin D with ultraviolet light, but there's something called nitric oxide, which also is released from exposure to ultraviolet light. There was a study that was done, in fact, um, looking at blood pressure and latitude. This was prior to 1980 when we started developing very effective blood pressure medications. And this study was done looking at the entire globe and measuring people's blood pressure in various countries and measuring the distances from the equator. And what they saw was very clear. It was subtle, but it was very clear and statistically significant. The further someone lived from the equator, the higher their blood pressure was. And we've shown this. Richard Weller, he's a dermatologist at University of Edinburgh in Scotland. He was actually on this paper, and he was one of the first to show that ultraviolet light exposure to the skin creates a molecule called nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is a second messenger system effector in the cell, which basically means that it is telling the systems in your body, the vasculature in your body, to relax. And so when the blood vessels relax, when they open up, now the pipes are bigger and the pressure inside those pipes are relieved and the pressure comes down. Well, this type of light is more abundant at the equator. And there's about a 5 to 7 millimeter difference when you go from the equator to the highest latitudes in that study. So, and by the way, not only going north, but also going south away from the equator, they also noted the same thing. So, vitamin D is a steroid hormone. That's important to understand because steroid hormones circulate throughout the body and they're able to penetrate through the cell surface and actually go into the nucleus of the cell where they are able to interact with transcription and DNA reading to make messenger RNAs. And messenger RNAs, of course, are what is the code for protein synthesis in your cells. So the reach here is very, very wide. What we see with ultraviolet light, multiple benefits. So how do you get this ultraviolet light? Well, you've got to be outside, and the sun has to be pretty high up in the sky. The darker your skin is, the more time outside you have to be to get this ultraviolet radiation because the melanin, not the melatonin, but the melanin in your skin actually blocks ultraviolet light. So if you're very fair skinned, and Fitzpatrick, in other words, there's different Fitzpatrick types of skin. One is the most whitest, and 6, I believe, is the most darkest. If you're one of those higher levels, you could get outside and get quickly your daily dose of ultraviolet radiation. If you're not, if your skin is darker in color, you've got to be out there for much longer. Think about this. I think we can all agree that the human race probably originated somewhere around Mesopotamia or Africa, somewhere close to the equator, and they were very likely dark-skinned people. As they moved away from the equator, think about what happened here in terms of adaptation. As these groups of people moved away from the equator and moved into Europe or even Northern Europe, the body's need for ultraviolet radiation was so constant, so powerful that those societies actually became lighter skinned because the availability of ultraviolet radiation at those latitudes was diminished enough that there had to be adaptations that the human race had to have in order to remain a viable race at those latitudes. In other words, their skin had to become more and more pale. If you think about it the other way, as you're going down to Australia, it's kind of an aberration there, is that there's quite a lot of ultraviolet light down in Australia, even though they are quite far away from the equator, and that has to do with the ozone layer and ozone blocking ultraviolet radiation. So there's a paucity or a lack of ozone around Australia, around the South Pole. And as a result of that, much more ultraviolet light comes in. Look at the people indigenous to Australia, very far away from the equator, as opposed to Northern Europe. The Northern Europeans, very light skinned traditionally. Who are the Aborigines of Australia? Still very dark skinned, interestingly. And I think as a result of that, we can kind of conclude maybe anthropologically that Australia's always had quite a bit of ultraviolet light. Now, what you do is you put people who are light skinned in an area where there's a lot of ultraviolet light, and you're going to get a lot of burning of the skin. Conversely, you take people who are darker skinned and you put them away from the equator where they already have a sort of a built-in mechanism to protect themselves from the abundance of ultraviolet radiation, which they're used to getting at the equator. And you put them in an environment where they're not getting enough ultraviolet light because they're not outside long enough. And now you introduce to them, the modernities of all of these technological advances, like being indoors, air conditioning. You can see very quickly how, and it's easy to understand why so many people at these latitudes can be very deficient in vitamin D.
Okay, you're making it very clear early on, which I think is critical, that when it comes to light, it's not just vitamin D. Because I think that can actually be a detriment to a lot of people who see it that way and figure, okay, this is getting complicated, different types of light, different, latitudes, skin colors. I'm just going to take vitamin D and be done with this. So you're making it clear, vitamin D, I know you're somebody that does take it. You feel it's important. It's a piece of this, but it's just a small piece of the whole picture here.
Vitamin D is necessary, but it's not sufficient. I think that sums up what we're talking about. And it's going to become even more clear when we start talking about infrared light, which is on the other extreme of that visible spectrum. Absolutely.
Okay, let's stick with UV right now. And I want to make sure before we leave this part, we're clear with people the goal here. Because again, with the variables, skin color, latitude, and even time of day is going to influence heavily the amount of UV. How does somebody know if they're getting enough? And let's start near the equator to eliminate that variable. And then I want to talk to the person like me. We were talking before the call. I'm in Ontario and we're in the middle of winter right now. What can I do by getting outside or hacking that to make sure I'm getting enough of this UV light?
Yeah, and UV is an interesting aspect because there are certainly beneficial effects to ultraviolet radiation, but there's also detrimental effects to ultraviolet radiation when used in the absence of the other types of light. So when used alone, we have evidence, at least on petri dishes and in labs, that ultraviolet radiation, because it is so high in energy, can actually cause mutations in the DNA, and that leads to cancers. So there's this concern about skin cancers. There's a concern about melanoma. Interestingly, there's a paper that just hit preprint, which is Richard Weller's paper looking at a UK biobank 400,000 large study where they looked at ultraviolet light and the differences, at least in England at that latitude, and what happened to people who had a lot of exposure to ultraviolet light and people who didn't have a lot of exposure. And basically what they found was that if everybody in the cohort, in the group that they studied, 400,000 UK biobank, if everybody had gotten the least amount of ultraviolet light in that cohort, okay, as opposed to being distributed, if everybody did exactly what everyone did to get the least amount of ultraviolet light, there would be about 30 or 40 less melanoma deaths over about 8 to 10 years, but there would be probably 2,000 or 3,000 more all-cause deaths, okay? On the other hand, if they were to have made everybody have the highest exposure of ultraviolet light in that cohort, then there would be about 30 or 40 more melanoma deaths and skin cancer deaths. But there would be up to 3,000 to 4,000 less all-cause mortality, so non-skin cancer deaths. And so there's kind of a trade-off. And so your question is how do you in Ontario get enough ultraviolet light, or anybody around the world get enough ultraviolet light, especially in the wintertime. Number one, I would highly recommend getting outside for as much as possible, and there'll be reasons why we talk about that later. But for ultraviolet purposes, even on days where the sun is not high enough to get ultraviolet light, let me tell you, there's a astrophysicist by the name of Bob Fosbury who believes that something called Rayleigh scattering, which is the reason why the sky is blue, because it takes that area of the spectrum and scatters it across the sky, across the canopy, that you can actually get the right amount of ultraviolet B radiation from the sky, even though the sun itself is not high enough. So there seems to be some evidence that you can get enough ultraviolet light even in the dead of winter by going outside if there is blue sky. Obviously, the clouds would block that. But if there's blue sky in the middle of the wintertime, getting outside. Now, of course, that ultraviolet's got to have to hit your skin somewhere. So if you're completely bundled up and only your face is showing, you're probably not going to get enough. Going back to that, I would say supplement. Now, the question is how much do you supplement? It's really difficult to tell because the amount of vitamin D that somebody needs to take in to get to a specific level is dependent on their age. It's dependent on their body mass index. The older you are, the more vitamin D you need. The larger you are, the more vitamin D that you need. And also, there are other extenuating circumstances as well. For instance, there's some studies, at least in animals, that indicate that high intake of high fructose corn syrup can actually inactivate vitamin D, turn it into the 24-25 version of vitamin D as opposed to the 125, which is the active form. So all that to say is that if you are concerned about your vitamin D levels because either you have darker skin and you live at higher latitudes, I would highly recommend consider supplementing with vitamin D, but I would even more highly recommend that you get your levels tested and make sure that you're at the appropriate level once you get on a certain amount of vitamin D. There's some people that supplement with vitamin D in the wintertime only, and they don't do it in the summer because they're outside enough. I think that's a reasonable way of doing it. The other thing I would just mention before leaving vitamin D is that vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, which means it's possible for you to collect enough vitamin D in the summertime and then have it stored, at least for some use, as you go into the wintertime and use your body's store. So it's not something that you need to take on a daily basis. In fact, some people administer vitamin D monthly because it is fat soluble. So anyway, those are some thoughts.
That's a point I wanted you to hit on there. The fact that the seasonality, especially in a place like Ontario, maybe that's just a normal response for the body to get different amounts of vitamin D and different amounts of sun as inputs in different times of the year.
Yeah.
So you mentioned vitamin D supplementation being a little bit different depending on variables for each person. What's the goal level you like to see with your patients?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's, first of all, let's talk about the units. Nanograms per deciliter, I believe, is the one that I use. It's sort of the lower one. It's the one that we use in the United States. There's the one in Europe, I think it's milliliters. Millimoles. Anyway, the one that I use is the nanograms. And for that, generally speaking, you'll see on the lab results that come back that they like that to be above 20 or 30. And that's been validated for bone. And I think that's probably realistic. I personally like to see in myself and also my patients a higher level. And it's only because of what I saw during COVID, where we correlated very well with vitamin D levels less than 50. As vitamin D levels started to come down less than 50, that's when we started to see an increase in the incidence of COVID-19 infections. So I don't believe that there's been a value that's been validated against infections or acute chest infections. I know that Martineau did a meta-analysis that was published in the British Medical Journal a number of years ago that showed that supplementation with vitamin D actually reduced acute chest infections. I'm not sure if he actually came up with a level where that seemed to be validated, but the level that I aim for is about 50. I think that's a reasonable level. And so I take supplemental vitamin D. I take about 4,000 units internationally daily. That's enough for me in my body, at my latitude, and my skin color to keep my levels at about 50. But everybody's different, and there is no magic dose. And so I would highly recommend that people get their levels checked because it may be too low, or more rarely, it could also be too high. There are a few case reports of vitamin D toxicity, so it is possible. I would just be careful and get your levels checked.
A lot of times with vitamin D, you see K2 being part of that supplement as a package. Do you think that's critical?
There are some studies that seem to indicate that vitamin K2, now this is not to be confused with vitamin K, which is obviously involved in anticoagulation, and it's an antagonist to coumadin. So this is K2, it's a little different. That it prevents the deposition of calcium in the blood vessels. So yeah, I have no problem with people taking vitamin K2 with the D as well.
As of late, I've been hearing this talk when it comes to vitamin D that it's actually used in rat poison. And there's a group of people, it seems to be gaining momentum, that are saying vitamin D supplementation is toxic and to avoid it. Have you heard this?
Yeah, I mean, in France, back in the Vendée War of the 1790s, they used to drown people in water, and that's how they kill people. Does that mean that water is dangerous and we shouldn't drink it? I mean, yeah, the rat poison's got high levels of vitamin D on purpose so that it's toxic. But just about I can't think of a single substance that we take into our body that, if given at high doses, wouldn't also be just as lethal. So yeah, I don't think that taking appropriate doses of vitamin D is toxic or lethal in any way, because that same argument could be used for just about any other thing. I could give people too much water. In fact, a woman, I use the France thing a little bit kind of tongue in cheek, but there was a radio station that put on a promotion to see who could drink the most amount of water, and this poor lady did win, but she died because she dropped her sodium too low because she drank too much water. Her brain swelled and she seized and died. So something as nutritious as water can also be taken to an extreme.
Good point. Have you heard of these spurty lamps or other brands or similar lights that can be used indoors, especially somebody like me in the wintertime, to synthesize some of what we'd get from sunlight?
I think we're getting better and better at that. I really have this philosophical problem with medical reductionism, where we try to find something that's good. We try to distill it down to its functional parts, isolate it, concentrate it, and then give it. Because when we do that, we take it out of its environment that it was placed in, and there may be actual beneficial associations with other factors around it that we may not understand. The case in point of that is the studies where we looked at lung cancer patients who had diets that were high in vitamin A and vitamin E, those types of substances. And so what we did was we ran trials where we gave high doses of vitamin A, vitamin E, beta carotene to lung cancer patients. They had to stop that study early because they found that those substances in high doses given away from the environment that they were normally in actually caused worse deaths. And so this idea of medical reductionism, where we find the magic particle, package it, and then patent it, and then sell it, I think it's never as good as the original.
Earlier, you talked about cancer and how balance is key, not getting too much light, not enough.
Yeah.
Let's bring sunscreen in and talk about people using that. Is there a healthy way to use that? Are there healthy sunscreens? Yeah, your thoughts in that realm.
Yeah, so what is sunscreen doing? It's the purpose of most sunscreens, although there are some sunscreens out there that actually want to block infrared light. I have no idea why they would ever want to do that. But most sunscreens are there to block ultraviolet light. You can block ultraviolet light with clothes, generally speaking. One or even two layers of clothing is plenty to block ultraviolet light. What I think people want, though, is they apply this sunscreen because they want to get out in the sun without the benefit of, or without the detriment of having clothes on, because they want a suntan. They want to be tanned. So if you look at the way they test sunlight, so let's talk about efficacy of sunscreen or sunblock. It has to be constantly be reapplied. it has to be on, it cannot be washed off. And that is the only way you can reach some of these SPFs that are published on these sunscreens. There's a big scandal going on right now in Australia. Because of the amount of melanoma cases, the government has actually kind of opened up and asked for products to be made so that people can get these sunscreen products. And what they found is that many of these products that are coming to market are not standing up to not even a tenth of what is published on the bottles. So the other effect of sunscreen is this psychological problem, where you are psychologically think that you're protected. So you put the sunscreen on, you've applied it, you haven't reapplied it, you didn't apply it properly, and now because you think that you're protected, you're going to spend more time out in the sun, and actually you might even lead to more skin damage. The other effect of this is the chemicals that they put in the thing. Have we actually tested these chemicals and how they get uptaken into the body, what their effect is on the body in the long term? We don't know a lot of these things because we haven't looked for these things, but we know that chemicals can be absorbed through the skin. That's why we make medicines that are patches, right? Lidocaine patches, fentanyl patches. We know that the skin absorbs chemicals, and certainly that's no different with sunscreen. So I think if you're trying to protect yourself from excessive ultraviolet radiation from the sun, which I think is perfectly appropriate, especially in people who live in environments where there's a lot of ultraviolet light and they have sensitive skin, then probably one of the most effective ways of doing that is to cover up and to wear a broad-rimmed hat, to wear a long-sleeve shirt, to go outside but not necessarily in direct sunlight, or to avoid direct sunlight between the hours of 10 o'clock a.m. and 2 o'clock p.m. or even 4 o'clock p.m., and then go out in the morning when the sun is coming up, which has a lot of other benefits which we'll talk about, or when the sun is setting. When the sun is at the rising aspect of the day and the setting aspect of the day, because it has to go through so much atmosphere to get to your eyes and to your body, there's really a minimal amount of ultraviolet radiation occurring at that time of day.
One thing you've hit on a couple times I want to highlight is with UV light, it doesn't go through the clothing versus what we're going to get into later with infrared, where we can still get our dose being clothed outside.
Yeah.
Before we part ways on the UV part, just to round everything off here, again, coming back to me in Ontario in the winter, we know it has to hit the skin to get the UV benefit. What is my best bet? Obviously exposing as much skin as possible, being out midday. But for me to get, as a Caucasian, light skin, what would I need to do throughout the winter to get a healthy dose of UV?
So some people would say that right now in Ontario in the wintertime, the sun is not high enough to produce vitamin D in your body. And I would say that that's probably true based on the height of the sun. Again, there is some disagreement in the scientific literature that you may be getting enough vitamin D through ultraviolet radiation through Rayleigh scattering from the sky. But let me just sort of reflect back. There was a study that was done, I believe it was Richard Weller again on this study, looking at COVID-19 mortality. And they specifically looked in the portion of the United States in the wintertime that was above, let's say, Tennessee, roughly speaking, where there was no way you could get enough ultraviolet radiation, similar to Ontario, where you could not get enough ultraviolet radiation to make vitamin D. Even in those, at that time, and even in those places, they were able to statistically show that the more sunlight that people had, the lower the COVID-19 deaths were. And this is in a paper that was published not only looking at the United States, but they validated in Great Britain, and they also validated in Italy, where in the wintertime, not enough vitamin D being produced, they thought, but still a benefit from a correlation with more sunlight. So to get back to your question, there's actually nomograms that have been published that show, like, if this is the time of year and this is your latitude, this is how much time you need to spend outside in the sun to get enough vitamin D in your system. And I don't have that in front of me at the moment. I can look it up. It's been a while since that's been published. But I remember looking at it and seeing that the longest amount of time that it took, it generally was around 5 to 15 to 20 minutes to about 30 minutes, generally speaking. But obviously in the wintertime in Ontario, in Canada, you're going to be 30 minutes plus to get enough of that light if you're going to get enough vitamin D.
And we also want to always come back to the thesis here where vitamin D is important, could potentially be a proxy for other things, but we know with UV specifically, there is NO, and there's probably a lot of things in our lifetime we won't even discover that UV is doing to the body.
Yeah, exactly. So that's, I mean, if we were to go 50 years ago, you would easily hear from the scientific community, oh, the only real benefits for going outside in the sun is getting your vitamin D. And that's because that's the only thing that we knew. We don't know what you don't know. And what we've discovered, especially in the last year or two, the science on this has really exploded. And we're finding out that the sun is way more than just vitamin D.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
We're spending so much time inside. We have windows that block infrared light because we don't want to increase our cooling costs. We have replaced all of the lights in our homes with LED bulbs. What Bob Fosbury calls this is the scurvy of the 21st century.